James Whitaker thought his vineyard was safe until the HOA claimed it as their own. Claire Manning believed the board was just a neighborhood formality until she uncovered their hidden land deals. And Daniel Ross never imagined police would march. Through private vines with papers demanding surrender together, their stories reveal how power, greed, and control can turn a peaceful community into a battlefield. The vineyard had been a dream carved out of soil and sunlight, something that had taken years of patience and persistence to create. It was more than land. It was a legacy, a place where every row of vines told a story of labor, hope, and sacrifice. The owner believed he had found peace, a retreat from the chaos of city life, where the rhythm of the seasons guided everything. Each morning began with the golden light spilling over the hills, dew clinging to the leaves, and the promise of a harvest yet to come. It seemed untouchable, a sanctuary shielded by distance from any prying eyes or petty disputes. But peace never lasts forever. And sometimes danger arrives not with noise and chaos, but with a single sheet of paper folded neatly inside an envelope. The letter arrived without warning, its envelope marked with an emblem that felt strangely out of place in this rural setting, the logo of a homeowners association. At first glance, it seemed almost laughable. The vineyard wasn't in a neighborhood lined with manicured lawns and picket fences. It was land, pure and open, separated from suburban streets by fences, dirt roads, and rolling fields. The idea that such an organization could claim authority over it made no sense. The words inside, however, were not written in confusion. They were sharp, deliberate, and carried the heavy tone of entitlement. The letter stated, in matter-of-fact language, that the vineyard stood on land falling within community jurisdiction. According to them, the property was not entirely private but subject to oversight by the board. It ended with a phrase that lingered longer than the rest. Failure to comply may result in enforcement actions. At first, the vineyard owner brushed it aside, convinced it was a mistake. Bureaucracies were known for errors, and perhaps this was just another piece of misfiled paperwork. He placed the letter in a drawer, choosing to forget it. The vines still needed tending, grapes needed watering, and life had its own demands. For a short while, everything seemed unchanged, but the thought of that letter gnawed at him quietly, creeping into moments when he least expected it. Could an organization that governed backyard fences and mailbox paint really have the power to touch acres of farmland? It didn't seem possible, and yet the certainty of the language suggested otherwise. Days later, he began to notice things he hadn't before. A car that lingered too long at the edge of his property, its driver appearing to write notes on a clipboard. A neighbor mentioning, almost casually, that the HOA had been talking about expansion. A sense of unease settled in, the kind that grows heavier when ignored. Even the quiet nights, once comforting, now felt different. The rustle of the wind in the vines carried with it the sound of something approaching, unseen but inevitable. The owner tried to reassure himself. He had legal deeds, proof of purchase, and years of history tied to the vineyard. But still, the letter existed, an official piece of paper that hinted at a battle he had not chosen. There was something unsettling about the way it was written. It wasn't just a claim. It was a declaration, as though his vineyard had already been decided for him. It didn't ask for permission. It demanded recognition. The beauty of the vineyard now felt shadowed, its rows of green no longer just fields of promise but borders under threat. Each sunrise that once brought peace now carried a question. How far would they go? What did enforcement truly mean? Been about nurturing life, but as the days passed after that first letter, it began to feel more like contested ground. What once seemed untouchable now stood at the edge of something darker. The first warning had been delivered, and the dream was no longer safe. Weeks passed. Fear at the vineyard owner could not ignore the tightening grip of the HOA. It began subtly, almost invisible at first, the kind of pressure that could easily be dismissed as paranoia. But each small occurrence, when stacked together, formed a picture too deliberate to be coincidence. The HOA board members, who had never shown interest in the rural stretch of land before, suddenly started driving by the property at odd hours. Their vehicles slowed as they passed the vineyard. Windows rolled down, clipboards balanced on steering wheels as they scribbled notes. Sometimes they stopped altogether, staring through the gate as though cataloging each detail of the land. It was not casual curiosity, it was surveillance. Soon after, anonymous notes began arriving in his mailbox. Some were typed, others handwritten, but all carried the same accusations. The vineyard was supposedly draining shared water resources. The land, they said, was an eyesore compared to the community aesthetic. One letter went so far as to call the vineyard a misuse of community property. These accusations had no foundation, yet the consistency of their arrival made them impossible to dismiss. The mailbox had once been a place of bills and catalogs. Now it was a channel for threats. The vineyard owner realized the HOA wasn't merely making claims, they were building a case. Each note, each slow drive-by, each complaint was a brick in a wall designed to box him in. The second letter, more official than the first, arrived with a harsher tone. This one came in certified mail, forcing him to sign for it. The message was straightforward. The vineyard must cease all operations immediately. The HOA claimed zoning violations, citing sections of community bylaws he had never seen before. It didn't matter that the property had functioned as farmland long before the HOA even existed. They twisted language and codes until they sounded legitimate, leaving him cornered by rules that didn't belong to him. At the bottom of the letter was a line written in bold. Non-compliance will result in enforcement measures, including but not limited to legal and physical intervention. The phrase unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. It was vague, but unmistakable. The words physical intervention lingered like a shadow over every corner of the vineyard. What did that mean? Would they trespass? Would they bring in authorities? The more he thought about it, the less far-fetched. It seemed at night the vineyard no longer felt like a sanctuary. Instead, the stillness of the fields seemed to echo with the possibility of intrusion. Headlights occasionally appeared on the road, pausing just long enough to suggest someone was watching before disappearing into the dark. Even the workers, once cheerful as they tended the vines, grew uneasy under the constant presence of strangers recording every detail from outside the fences. The atmosphere grew heavy, as though the vineyard itself was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable strike. The owner began to realize this was not a matter of confusion or paperwork. The HOA was not mistaken, they were intentional. The vineyard was valuable, too valuable, and they had set their eyes on it. What they wanted was not compliance, they wanted possession. Each letter was not simply an order, but a step in a strategy. To wear him down, to isolate him, to make the weight of opposition so crushing that surrender seemed like the only option. But surrender was not in his nature. He began keeping records of his own, photographing cars parked near the vineyard, saving every letter, every complaint, every certified envelope. He documented each strange occurrence in the hopes of building a defense. Still, deep down, he knew the odds were stacked against him. An individual could not easily stand against an organization with money, influence, and the law already bent in their favor. The vines stood tall and green in the sunlight, but the air around them carried a tension that could not be ignored. The HOA had escalated their fight from whispers to warnings, from paper to intimidation. It was no longer about grapes or zoning codes. It was a battle for control, and the vineyard was ground they intended to claim. The question was no longer if they would strike, but when. The escalation came one morning with a sound that broke the vineyard's fragile quiet, the crunch of tires on gravel. Heavy and deliberate, followed by the unmistakable sweep of flashing lights. Police cruisers rolled up the driveway, their presence sudden and undeniable, like an iron fist knocking at the heart of the property. The vineyard, once a place of calm routines and silent growth, transformed instantly into a scene of authority. The officers stepped out, uniforms pressed, boots polished. In their hands were folded documents bearing the unmistakable emblem of the HOA. What had once been whispered threats and cryptic letters had now materialized into physical force. Neighbors gathered just beyond the fence, drawn by the flashing lights like moths to a flame. They whispered to one another, their faces pale with curiosity and unease. Some shook their heads as if they had known this was coming all along. Others simply watched in silence, waiting to see what would happen next. The vineyard owner stood frozen, caught between disbelief and dread, watching as the officers spread across his land as though it already belonged to someone else. The documents they carried were bold declarations. According to them, the vineyard was in violation of community bylaws and zoning restrictions, and immediate compliance was required. The land, they claimed, was being illegally utilized, and unless it was vacated, legal seizure could follow. It didn't matter that the vineyard had stood there for years. Long before the HOA reached its tendrils into the surrounding area, paper and signatures now outweighed history and hard work. The officers did not raise their voices or show aggression, but their mere presence was intimidating. They walked the rows of vines as if conducting an inspection, taking notes, pointing at irrigation systems, snapping photographs. The vineyard, once a testament to labor and dedication, was being dissected like evidence in a case. The owner trailed behind them, powerless, his heart pounding at the realization that his sanctuary was no longer under his control. The show of force had a clear message: resistance would not be tolerated. The HOA had escalated their campaign from threats on paper to boots on the ground, using law enforcement as their weapon. The police did not damage anything, yet their presence carved invisible scars into the land. Every step they took through the vineyard felt like a violation, a reminder that he was not as protected as he once believed. When the officers finally left, the silence they left behind was suffocating. The neighbors who had gathered slowly dispersed, murmuring to one another, carrying stories that would spread quickly through the community. The vineyard owner remained standing in the dirt road, staring at the ruts left by the tires, as if the ground itself had been branded. Nothing had been taken physically, but something important had been stripped away: the illusion of safety. That night, the weight of it all pressed down harder than ever. The house that overlooked the vineyard felt exposed, every window a vulnerable eye. The soft rustle of the vines in the wind no longer brought peace but suspicion, as though someone were moving through them unseen. He could not shake the memory of the officers' calm voices, their papers signed and sealed, their confidence that the HOA's claim was real and enforceable. The realization settled like stone in his chest. This was no longer a fight over petty complaints or neighborhood disputes. This was organized, deliberate, and backed by authority. The HOA had revealed their power, showing that they could summon the weight of law enforcement with nothing more than signatures on a page. If they could send police once, they could do it again the next time. They might not leave so quietly. The vineyard, which had always been a symbol of growth and freedom, now felt more like a fortress under siege. Every row of vines was no longer just a crop, but a line of defense, a reminder of what was at stake. The first battle had been fought, without fists or weapons, but the war for the vineyard had truly begun. The vineyard owner could not allow the memory of police walking through his land to fade into silence. It haunted him, filling every moment with a gnawing thought: if they could bring the weight of authority onto his property so easily, what would stop them from doing it again, or worse, taking it all away for good? Fear alone was not enough to protect him. If he wanted to understand what he was facing, he needed to dig deeper into the HOA, to uncover how far their reach truly extended. What began as curiosity quickly grew into obsession, a nightly routine of combing through documents, public records, and whispers from those who had crossed paths with the association before. At first, what he found was subtle, buried in minutes from meetings and scattered records of land transfers. Small details pointed to a pattern, though nothing was obvious unless pieced together. Families had once owned homes on the outskirts of the community, properties filled with history and personal investment, yet over time, one by one, those families disappeared. Their names vanished from county records, their homes listed as foreclosures, then sold at suspiciously low prices to shell companies linked back to the HOA. Within months, those houses were demolished, and new luxury developments appeared, each one tied neatly to the board's portfolio. It wasn't random chance. It was a slow, calculated expansion. The deeper he searched, the darker the trail became. Newspaper archives spoke of lawsuits, neighbors who had dared to challenge the board only to drown under waves of legal fees. Buried in court filings were stories of intimidation fines stacked so high they became unbearable. Restrictions imposed until families had no choice but to sell. Yet none of these stories ever gained traction beyond whispers. The HOA operated with precision, keeping their movements quiet, making sure the public saw them as nothing more than a neighborhood organization ensuring order and beauty. But beneath the polished image, the truth was something closer to a machine designed to consume. The vineyard owner realized his land wasn't just an inconvenience to them, it was a prize. Acres of fertile soil, valuable for development or resale, stood like a jewel within their reach. They had no interest in rules or aesthetics. Their goal was expansion, and his vineyard was next on the list. It was not only land records that revealed their power, but also the connections he uncovered between the HOA and local officials. Campaign donations traced back to board members. Emails obtained through public requests showed city planners giving preferential treatment to developments tied to the association. Permits that should have taken months were approved in weeks. It was a web of influence woven tightly enough that resistance seemed futile. The realization hit him with cold clarity. The police who had walked through his vineyard were not there by mistake. They were an extension of that influence, a tool wielded by people who knew how to bend the law in their favor. The vineyard owner began reaching out quietly to former residents who had once lived under the HOA's control. Some were reluctant to speak, their voices tinged with fear, but others opened up after hearing his story. They described the same tactics: threats disguised as formal notices, endless inspections, unexpected visits from officials, and eventually, the crushing financial weight of fines. The HOA strategy was clear: they didn't take property by force at first. They broke people down until surrender was the only escape. Armed with testimonies and records, the vineyard owner finally understood the scope of the battle. This was not about whether his vineyard broke a zoning rule. It was about a machine that thrived on acquisition, on turning homes and land into stepping stones for profit and control. He had stumbled into the path of something far larger than himself. The realization was terrifying, but it also hardened him. If he gave in now, the vineyard would vanish, consumed like the homes before it. But if he fought, he would have to face not just board members with clipboards, but an entire system of money, influence, and fear. The vines that stood so quietly outside his window at night no longer represented just harvests and seasons, they symbolized resistance. Each row was a reminder of what he stood to lose and what he could not allow them to take. The HOA did not wait long before making their next move. The vineyard owner had barely finished piecing together the evidence of their corruption when another notice arrived. This one delivered by hand. It was heavier than the others, thick with legal jargon and printed on official letterhead, warning that the board was now initiating proceedings to seize the vineyard entirely. The wording was more aggressive, stripped of the vague language from before. It read like a final demand, declaring that his land was no longer his to control. What had once been whispers and threats had now become a direct claim of ownership. Along with the letter came a date, a deadline, by which he was expected to vacate. It was a line drawn in the soil, and it carried with it the weight of inevitability.